The raid begins, not with glory, but with blood. Forget the horned helmets. Forget the charming anti-heroes with glistening abs and good intentions. And forget everything you've seen in Hollywood that turns Viking raids into glorified adventures. This is not that story. The year is 793 AD. The target is Lindisfarne, a quiet island off the northeast coast of what is now England. Peaceful, isolated, holy, and utterly unprepared for what's about to hit them. At dawn, the horizon splits open like a wound. Longships appear like shadows on the sea, their dragon heads snarling toward shore. By the time the monks of Lindisfarne even notice them, it's already too late. There is no warning, no mercy, no rules of engagement. The first axe splits a monk's skull during morning prayers. Blood hits the stone walls like paint. These are not noble warriors seeking honor. They are butchers on a holy killing ground. This, right here, is where the Viking Age really begins. And it's far more terrifying, more strategic, and more brutal than Hollywood dares to show. The myth of the heroic raider. For decades, Viking raids have been romanticized. The idea of a lone hero with an axe, conquering lands for glory, women, and fame. In truth, Viking raids were calculated terror campaigns. These were not berserkers foaming at the mouth, at least not always. They were farmers turned warriors, merchants turned murderers, who knew the exact when, where, and how to strike. Lindisfarne wasn't chosen at random. It was a wealthy monastic center, full of gold, relics, and manuscripts, undefended and sacred. A soft target with high rewards. And striking a Christian holy site sent a message not just to England, but to all of Christendom. The Norse had arrived, and your gods couldn't stop them. Who were the raiders? So who were these men who brought fire and terror to the shores of Europe? They weren't kings or warlords. Most early raiders were small bands of local warriors, driven by poverty, famine, and opportunity. Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th centuries was a harsh tribal land. Long winters, little arable land, warring clans. Younger sons had no inheritance, no future. So they built ships, they sailed, and they took what they could not grow. Viking ships, the famous longships, were marvels of engineering. Shallow drafted and terrifyingly fast. They could slip up rivers, raid deep inland, and disappear before local forces even rallied. To the Anglo-Saxons, it felt like they came out of the sea itself. What Hollywood gets wrong in film and TV, Viking raids are often shown as glorious battlefield brawls. But real raids? They were ambushes, slaughters. Vikings didn't fight fair. They didn't need to. A typical raid was over in minutes. Strike fast, burn homes, kill any resistance, take captives, grab loot, run. Women and children weren't spared. Many were taken as slaves, thralls in Norse culture, shackled and sold in ports like Hedeby or Dublin. Others were killed outright if they slowed the raiders down. And the brutality wasn't random, it was tactical. Fear was a weapon, just as effective as the axe. Entire villages would abandon their posts at the mere sight of sails on the horizon. Why fight when you knew what was coming? A different code of honor Hollywood often paints Vikings as noble pagans with their own warrior code. And yes, they did have a warrior ethos, but it didn't look like chivalry or bushido. In Norse culture, strength was morality. Success in battle was a sign of favor from the gods, especially Odin, the god of war and wisdom. Cowardice was shameful. Dying with a sword in hand meant entry to Valhalla. But here's what they don't tell you. That sword, it might have been taken from a terrified Saxon child. That honorable death, it might have come after slaughtering an unarmed village. It wasn't about fairness, it was about domination. Rape, slavery, and silence. There's one more brutal truth the movies always skip. The sexual violence. In almost every major raid recorded by Christian chroniclers, from Ireland to France to Spain, there are mentions of women being kidnapped, assaulted, or trafficked. Viking slavery was massive. Slaves were one of their most profitable exports. Captives were branded, chained, and sold in massive markets, sometimes kept for years to be used for labor or worse. And Norse sagas themselves, when not boasting, are often silent about these acts, because they weren't considered crimes. They were the spoils of war. For the raiders, it was just business. And yet, they were human. But here's the paradox. These same men, brutal, ruthless, returned home to plant crops, raise families, and tell stories by the fire. They wrote poetry, they made art. They worshipped gods who demanded not blind violence, but strength, wisdom, and fate. It's this duality that made the Viking Age so terrifying and so fascinating. One day, your village might trade with them. The next, it might burn. Part 2. When the storms never left. At first, the raids came like lightning. Fast, sudden, terrifying. But then, something changed. By the mid-800s, the storms didn't retreat to sea. The longships didn't just strike and vanish, they stayed. And the Viking Age entered its most dangerous phase, not as raiders, but as occupiers. The Great Heathen Army. In 865 AD, something unprecedented landed on the shores of East Anglia. Chroniclers called it the Great Heathen Army, a vast coalition of Viking warbands from across Scandinavia. Not 30 men, not 300, but thousands. Led by legendary figures, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, Halfdan Ragnarsson, sons of the mythical Ragnar Lothbrok. But this was not a quest for revenge like the sagas suggest. It was strategic colonization. The goal? Take England piece by piece. Not for loot, but for land. How they fought. War tactics without rules. Viking war tactics were unlike anything the Anglo-Saxons had faced. Forget large open battles with orderly lines. Vikings fought dirty, unpredictably. They avoided direct confrontation until the odds were stacked in their favor. They struck at dawn. They ambushed supply lines. They used river routes to appear deep inland, hitting vulnerable abbeys and towns far from military centers. And they took fortresses not by siege, but by subterfuge. At Wareham in 876, they made a treaty with Alfred of Wessex, swearing on holy relics. That night, they broke it, raided the countryside, and vanished. To Vikings, oaths to Christians meant nothing. Only oaths sworn on Thor, Odin, or blood held weight. Why no one could stop them? So how did a few thousand Norse warriors hold an entire kingdom hostage? Because England, in the 800s, wasn't one nation. It was a patchwork of rival kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex. They didn't trust each other. They didn't coordinate defense. And the Vikings exploited that perfectly. Local kings paid them off. Danegeld, Danish money. Huge sums of silver to make them go away. But it didn't work. Paying Vikings was like feeding wolves meat and hoping they'd become vegetarians. Each payment just funded the next fleet. The cost of invasion. By 870, the Vikings had taken East Anglia and Northumbria. Monasteries were emptied, churches burned, towns depopulated. Survivors became refugees, or thralls. But the Norse didn't just pillage. They settled. They brought wives, children, craftsmen. They carved up the conquered lands and renamed them. The eastern half of England became known as the Danelaw, a Viking-governed region where Norse law, language, and customs ruled. It was here that a strange fusion began, where Scandinavia bled into Saxon England. Life under Viking rule. So what did Viking occupation look like? Surprisingly, it wasn't endless violence. In many cases, once land was taken, the raiders became landlords. Trade expanded. Norse towns grew places like York, or Jorvik as they called it. Archaeological digs there reveal thriving markets, silver coinage, imported silk, Arab coins. In York alone, tens of thousands of items have been uncovered: brooches, tools, dice, combs. These weren't just warriors, they were settlers, businessmen, tax collectors. But the brutality never fully went away. Slavery continued. Raiding parties still launched from Norse-held towns into unconquered regions. And for many English Christians, living under Viking rule was a humiliation, a daily reminder that their gods had failed them. Resistance rises, the last defender. But resistance was coming. In Wessex, the last unconquered kingdom, a young king prepared for war. His name was Alfred. He would become known as Alfred the Great. And unlike his peers, he didn't pay off the Norse. He studied them, adapted to them. He built a navy to match their longships, fortified towns called burhs to block Viking expansion. And most importantly, he waited. In 878, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred met the Viking army led by Guthrum. It was savage, close-quarters combat, and Alfred won, not just the battle, but a peace that would divide England into two realms, Wessex in the south and the Danelaw in the north. A fragile truce. The price of peace. The Vikings had lost the chance to conquer all of England, but they still controlled half of it, and in those territories their culture took root. Norse names like Grim, Eric, Thorkel became common. Words like sky, knife, egg, window entered English. Even days of the week, Thursday, Thorsday, Friday, Frigg's Day, Bear. The mark of Norse gods. Their impact wasn't just bloody, it was linguistic, cultural, and permanent. The myth of the unified raiders. One more Hollywood lie needs exposing. The idea that Viking invaders were united, one people under one banner. In reality, Viking society was deeply tribal. Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Gotlanders, even different fjords had rivalries. Raiding parties often fought each other more than they fought their enemies. In Ireland, Norse Dublin clashed with Norse Limerick. In France, Norse warlords competed over territory. Unity was the exception, not the rule. And it was that disunity that would eventually crack the Viking war machine. Part 3. Ireland, a beautiful land turned bloody. When we think of Viking raids, England usually takes the spotlight, but some of the most brutal, most sustained, and most horrifying Viking campaigns happened further west. Ireland, green, rich, tribal, was a dream for Norse warbands, and the Irish would suffer under their axes for over 200 years. The raid on Rathlin Island. It began in 795 AD, just 2 years after the infamous Lindisfarne raid. Norse ships arrived at Rathlin Island off Ireland's northeastern coast. They burned the monastery. They killed the monks. From that moment, Ireland became a target, not for conquest, not at first, but for repeated extraction. Ireland's monasteries were rich, isolated, and undefended. For the Vikings, it was like robbing banks with no guards. Over the next 2 decades, they returned again and again, carving bloody routes through counties that still bear the scars. Unlike England, there was no kingdom to unite. What made Ireland even more vulnerable was its political chaos. Dozens of small kingdoms, Tuatha, constantly at war with one another. There was no Ireland as one country, just shifting alliances and bitter rivalries. Vikings didn't just exploit this, they amplified it. Irish kings sometimes invited Norse warbands to help them fight rivals. And once inside the gates, the raiders didn't leave. The founding of Dublin, born in blood. In 841 AD, the Vikings did something new. They didn't just raid Dublin, they settled it. They built a fortified shipyard called a long fort at the mouth of the river Liffey. From that base, they began raiding deeper inland and created a permanent presence. Dublin became a Norse stronghold, a slave market, a hub for stolen treasure, a gateway to the Irish heartland. For centuries, Dublin was not an Irish city. It was a Viking one. Ireland's forgotten horrors. Some of the worst atrocities of the Viking Age happened here, far from the Hollywood lens. Slavery in Viking Dublin was industrial. Captives, men, women, even children, were marched from the countryside, shackled together, and sold to Norse traders from as far as Spain, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Those who resisted were tortured or publicly executed. Christian monks wrote in horror about the dismemberment of bishops and the desecration of relics. They called the Vikings wolves among the flock, and for over a century, those wolves hunted freely. Scotland. No mercy for the north of Ireland, Scotland faced its own Norse nightmare. The Picts, a proud people of stone fortresses and warrior clans, were not spared. Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, all fell under Norse control by the early 9th century. And in 839 AD, a combined Viking force annihilated the Pictish king and his heir in a single battle. That one defeat shattered Pictish resistance forever. The Northern Isles became Norse territories for generations. Today, Norse names still echo there: Thurso, Stornoway, Lerwick. Scotland was never fully conquered, but it was changed forever. Across the Channel, France in flames. The Vikings didn't stop at the British Isles. Their ships crossed the Channel. They moved up the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne. Frankish France, the heart of the Carolingian Empire, was next. The Siege of Paris. When the empire bowed in 845 AD, 120 Viking ships sailed up the Seine and besieged Paris. Led by a fearsome warrior known only as Regan Harris, possibly Ragnar Lothbrok himself. The city's defenders tried to block the river with chains. The Vikings broke through. They burned churches. They slaughtered anyone in their way. And then they demanded ransom. The Emperor Charles the Bald paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to leave, and so they did. But the message was clear. Even the capital of an empire was not safe from the Norse tide. Normandy, a kingdom of former raiders. By the early 900s, Viking raids on France had become so frequent, the king gave them land to stop the violence. A Norse chieftain named Rollo was granted the region that became Normandy, land of the Northmen. In exchange, he converted to Christianity and pledged loyalty to the crown. But his descendants didn't stay quiet for long. In 1066, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, a man named William, would cross the Channel and conquer England itself. The raiders hadn't just become rulers, they had become kings. Viking cruelty, not just a tactic, a reputation. Why were the Vikings feared more than any other enemy? Because their cruelty wasn't just real, it was remembered. In Ireland, people abandoned entire regions for decades after raids. In France, towns were built inland, away from river routes. And in England, stories of Viking atrocities were passed down like nightmares, flaying priests alive, killing children in front of parents, using terror as currency. Were all of these true? Maybe not every tale, but enough were. And when you don't just defeat your enemy, but traumatize them, you don't need an army. Just a sail on the horizon. Part 4. The Storm Breaks. For nearly 300 years, Viking raiders terrorized the coasts of Europe. They burned cities, toppled kingdoms, built empires with blood and iron. But nothing lasts forever. By the late 11th century, the longships were vanishing, the axes were rusting, and the Viking Age was dying. Not with a final battle, but with a slow, inevitable unraveling. Why did the raids stop? The decline of Viking raids wasn't due to one cause, but many. First, the element of surprise was gone. In the 800s, Vikings could appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish. By the thousands, Europe had changed. Coastlines were fortified, rivers guarded, towns walled. The same Viking tactics that once broke kingdoms now met steel and stone. Second, Christianity. As more Norse leaders converted, the old raider culture fractured. It's hard to justify burning a monastery when you now worship the same god. By 995, Norway's king Olaf Tryggvason converted, often by force, and brought his people with him. Denmark followed, then Sweden. The raiders became Christians, then kings, then rulers of nations. The Vikings turned inward. By the 11th century, Scandinavia was no longer a chaotic land of feuding clans. It had kings, courts, coins, cities. The same energy once spent on raiding was now spent on ruling. Viking warbands became royal armies. Their longships became merchant fleets. Their gods Odin, Thor, Freya were replaced by saints and bishops. And as Europe stabilized, the Viking era simply didn't fit anymore. The last raid. So when did the final Viking raid happen? The last major one struck England in 1066, led by King Harald Hardrada of Norway. A warrior, a poet, a legend. Harold landed in Yorkshire with a fleet demanding the crown of England. But just days later, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, he was ambushed by the Anglo-Saxons. His forces were crushed. Harold died with an arrow to the throat. That battle is often called the end of the Viking Age, not just because Harold fell, but because he was the last great Viking, a relic of a fading world. A strange twist, the Viking bloodline returns. But fate has a sense of irony. Just 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, England was invaded again not by Norsemen, but by Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France over a century earlier. William the Conqueror, a great-great-grandson of Rollo, defeated the Saxons at the Battle of Hastings, and became King of England. So while the Viking raids had ended, their legacy had not. The descendants of raiders now wore crowns. They ruled courts, not coasts. The cost of an age. So what did the Viking Age leave behind? Across Europe, ruins, trauma, and bloodlines. In Ireland, burned monasteries and a Norse-founded capital, Dublin. In England, Norse law and language shaped what it meant to be English. In France, Normandy became a springboard for empire. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is psychological. The idea of the Viking savage, cunning, unstoppable still haunts history. To this day, their image is used in sports teams, movies, branding, but the truth? They weren't gods, they weren't monsters, they were human beings who built their futures on the suffering of others and paid for it with time. Part 5. The Aftermath. The Viking Age is over. The sails have lowered, the axes are quiet, but their shadow still stretches across centuries. Not as myth, not as glory, but as history. The real Viking raiders were neither heroes nor demons. They were men caught between survival and ambition, faith and fear, blood and destiny. Hollywood told you they were legends. But the truth? They were storms in human form, and when they passed, they left scars in the soil, the soul, and the story of Europe itself. Remember them not for what we want them to be, but for what they truly were. The age of raids has ended, but the truth still echoes.